Ilyas Bulbulia, and I'll be with you for the next hour. As our regular viewers are aware, on Just Law we normally advise on different aspects of English law. Today, as we've done before, we are going to discuss matters relating to immigration law. But although we'll be dealing with immigration matters today, because it's a live show, viewers are able to call in and ask us questions on any aspect of the law. It doesn't necessarily have to be limited to immigration matters. It can be on any aspect of the law. We should be able to cover matters as diverse as family matters, criminal matters, personal injury matters. So whatever your queries are in relation to legal matters, please do call in and ask us what your questions are, and hopefully I should be able to guide you in relation to that. Just a couple of matters before we get going. Obviously it's a live show, so we're not able to take very detailed instructions from callers. So if it transpires that I need to speak to you in depth, then I'll ask you to leave your number, and then I'll speak to you after the show, and we can have a more in-depth conversation. And obviously, because it's a live show, we're not able to look at documents, so to some extent we will have to provide generic advice where we are unable to see the documents. But in my experience on this show, in probably 99% of cases, based on the queries that we get live on air, we should be able to give quite good firm advice in relation to the queries that you have. So whatever questions you have, do please pick up the phone, give us a ring, and inshallah we'll have a discussion in relation to that. Now, as I said at the outset, today we'll be dealing with immigration matters. And what I want to do today is pick a topic which is the most popular area of immigration law, which is to do with how you can sponsor your spouse to come to the United Kingdom. And in practice, as far as immigration lawyers are concerned, this is normally the area of law where you get the most inquiries. People want to know how, once they've got married abroad, how they can sponsor their husband or wife to come to the United Kingdom. And increasingly over the years, it has become more and more difficult. Pre-2012, matters were much more simple. In terms of the documents that you needed to submit to support your application, it was much more simple. But unfortunately, what's happened over the years is that the Home Office has become much more prescriptive. They've set out very detailed rules about how the requirements can be met, and they've set out very detailed rules about the kind of documents that need to be submitted to make a successful application from abroad. So what I want to do today is to look at that in greater detail. But whatever your questions are on immigration matters, please do pick up the phone and give us a ring, and we can have a discussion about that. Now, when a spouse application is made from abroad, whether it's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or whichever country it is, to some extent there are similarities in terms of the documents that need to be submitted. So irrespective of where the application is made from, in practice 95% of the documents are the same, irrespective of where the application is made from. There are some requirements which are specific to certain countries, which we'll highlight later on. But if we initially look at the sort of standard documents which need to be submitted to make a successful application, it's sometimes easier to split the list up in terms of the documents which are available in the home country, whether it's India, Pakistan, etc., and the documents which are normally available within the United Kingdom. Some documents will relate to documents relating to the applicant, the person who's abroad. And the vast majority of documents, on the other hand, will relate to documents which the sponsor in the United Kingdom has. So let's look at what kind of documents does the applicant need to get together to support a successful spouse application. Well, initially, as our viewers will be aware, there is a requirement that the applicant has to pass an English test. And this was a requirement introduced now many years ago, introduced actually by the Labour Party many years ago. And the idea behind it was that anybody who's coming from abroad should have a certain level of understanding of spoken English, and the idea behind it is that somebody who has a understanding of the English language, once they come to the United Kingdom, they will be able to, fit in to the community much more easily, fit in within the country much more easily. And the idea is that from abroad, when you're making the initial application, the applicant will submit a certificate where the competency is tested in both spoken and one's ability to understand English. So it's speaking and listening which is tested at a very basic level, the most basic level that this examination system deals with, which is the A1 level, which is the most basic test in speaking and listening in English. The idea is to pass that test before coming to the United Kingdom, and then whilst in the United Kingdom, when someone applies for the visa to be extended, for them to do an English test at the next level, and then ultimately when they apply for indefinite leave after 5 years, to do another test at a much higher level. So it's like a stepping stone. Initially the test is at an A1 level, the next level at the extension stage is at A2, and then finally when an indefinite leave to remain application is made, a test at B1 level needs to be passed. So looking at the initial entry clearance application, the requirement is simply to pass an A1 test in English. And it's only two components which are tested, which is speaking and listening. That does to some extent make it much easier for applicants to pass the test, because the other two components, which is reading and writing, which applicants normally find more difficult, that is simply not tested at all, whether at the initial entry clearance stage or for the extension or for the indefinite leave to remain stage. It's only your speaking and listening ability in English which is tested. So the initial requirement is that the applicant needs to pass the A1 test in English. What you need to bear in mind that it's only certain types of qualifications which are acceptable. So it's not acceptable to simply sit a test where your English ability is tested. It has to be a test which is approved by the Home Office, and there's a whole list of places where one can go to do or undertake the test in English. The good thing is that the validity date of the English test is 2 years. So once you've done the test, it remains valid for 2 years. So even if there's a problem with the spouse application, it's not a problem as such as far as the English certificate is concerned, because it will be a certificate which can be used later on as well. Even if you have to reapply 6 months, 1 year down the line, it remains valid for 1 year. So that's the first requirement which needs to be fulfilled, which is that the applicant needs to pass an English test. Where the applicant struggles to pass the test, they normally, in my experience, attend a course in their home country. And in my experience, even if somebody has a very, very basic understanding of English, normally within the space of 2 to 3 months, they are able to, if they attend a course, get to a stage where they are comfortably able to pass the A1 test in English. Now, there are some exceptions to the English language requirement. If the applicant is over the age of 65, there's no need to pass the test in English. And similarly, if there's a medical reason why a person is unable to pass the test, maybe they have some kind of mental illness, maybe they have a problem with speaking, etc. If there is a medical reason and medical evidence can be produced to support the fact that someone is unable to medically, for medical reasons, undertake the test, then there is an exemption as well for that. But I have to say, the exemption is actually applied very, very strictly. So if it's the case that somebody is simply struggling to pass the test, then they're better off undertaking more courses and then trying to pass it, because as far as the evidence that is required to be granted the exemption from the English test, that is quite strict in terms of the evidence that has to be produced. And in my experience, if the Home Office is not satisfied with the medical evidence that is produced, it tends to refuse the application and obviously there is a right of appeal, but the problem with the right of appeal that it seems to be taken in the region of about a year, 1 year, 2 months, 1 year, 3 months for the appeal hearing to be listed. So there's a significant amount of time that would be taken in terms of the delay in processing a refusal. So one has to be very, very careful before trying to rely on the exemption, because there is always a risk that if you're relying on an exemption, even if it's the medical exemption, then it may not be accepted by the Home Office, and the case will end up going into an appeal, and the lengthy delay that will follow as a result of that. So if at all it is possible for those who are under the age of 65, it is better for them to try and pass the English test. Now, the other requirement that the applicant in their home country needs to satisfy is that they need to submit a TB certificate. Basically, it's a certificate which confirms that the person is free of TB, and there's certain tests that will be done before such a certificate is issued. And normally, in my experience, I've only come across 1 or 2 cases in the last 10-20 years where the applicant has had a problem with successfully obtaining a TB certificate, and all that's happened with them is that they've had to undergo some kind of treatment, and within a space of a couple of months they've been able to satisfy the requirement and obtain a TB certificate. Now, the important thing about the TB certificate is, firstly, it has to be obtained from an approved clinic. There are limited approved clinics around the world, so one has to check the Home Office website in order to see where the approved clinics are. So it's not simply a case of going to any hospital and asking for a medical test to be done. That wouldn't be sufficient. It has to be a TB test at a particular approved clinic. Now, secondly, and more importantly in practice, is that the TB certificate is only valid for 6 months. So it should normally be undertaken closer to the time of the actual application. There's no point doing the TB test straight away and then finding that there's a problem in getting the application together, and therefore there is the problem with the TB certificate actually expiring. So it's better, once the documents are ready, towards the end for the TB test to be done, and then at least you have an up-to-date TB certificate. The other thing to bear in mind is that when a person goes to do the TB test, what's normally required as proof of identity, normally in most countries, the proof of identity is your passport. So obviously the TB test has to be done before the actual application is submitted. The problem is, once the application is submitted, you have to submit your valid passport. If you forgot to do your TB test, you're not going to be able to get your passport back, or if you do try, it will be very difficult to try and get your passport back in order to do the TB test. So obviously get the TB test done, but ideally do it just before the application is to be submitted, so it's up to date and it's valid for the coming 6 months. Just on that point, once you've made the application with a valid certificate, and in some cases it takes the Home Office a considerable amount of time to consider the spouse application. During that time, if the TB certificate was to expire, it's not a problem as such. Let's take our first call for the day. Hello, अस्सलाम वालेकुम।
वालेकुम सलाम। कैसे हैं? ठीक है
जी, अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह ठीक है। आप कैसे हो भाई? ठीक हो?
मैं अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह ठीक था। मैं अली बात कर रहा हूँ ब्रसेल से।
जी।
I have one question here. My father is EU national here.
जी, okay.
And he is working last 3 years in United Kingdom.
जी, okay.
And he is nearly 70 years old now here.
जी, ठीक है।
And he want to apply for his PR residence less than 3 years because he's a permanent incapacity, or you can say he's a age of retirement.
जी, जी।
I'm a family member of my dad as well, and I joined him last 1 year with my other family members as well.
Okay.
Do we get a permanent residence at the same time, or do we have to apply after 5 years? I have one more question as well. If I want to bring my wife as my dependent here in future here, so does my dad have to apply for my wife as extended member, or I have to apply?
You know,
can answer both of the questions.
Your nationality, what's your nationality? Do you have European nationality or
No, I'm a Pakistani
Pakistan
national. I have an EU resident card.
I understand. Or in terms of your residence in the United Kingdom, how long have you been in the United Kingdom?
I have been United Kingdom last 7 years, but in terms of EU family member, I've been a family member last 1 year, and my other family member, they joined my father last 1 year as well.
Okay, right. In terms of your father's position, I think that's fairly straightforward. He spent 3 years in the United Kingdom. If he's going to retire, he should be able to qualify for permanent residence. Normally, the requirement is that you need to have worked for 5 years in the United Kingdom, but there are exceptions for people who actually are retiring from employment. Now, if your father has worked for 3 years and is retiring, then he will qualify for permanent residence. So as far as your father's position is concerned, that's not a problem. The difficulty really is with your situation, because as a dependent, you would still need to spend 5 years in the United Kingdom before you're eligible to apply for indefinite leave to remain. You wouldn't be able to apply now because you've only spent 3 years in the United Kingdom. Now, and as far as your wife is concerned, now the problem with your wife's application is that until you get indefinite leave, you won't be in a position to sponsor her to come to the United Kingdom. And from what you've said, you wouldn't be eligible to apply for indefinite leave for another 2 years. So normally what would happen is that you would qualify for indefinite leave. At that stage, you would be able to sponsor your wife to come to the United Kingdom. Sorry, go on.
Sorry to cut you. Sorry to interrupt you. I've see the regulation which is extended family member. Like if my dad want to apply for my wife, like as a son's wife, as extended family, because we are the same household, and we share everything as like essentially or whatever.
There is a problem with the extended family member applications because the requirements are actually quite strict. The requirements are not simply that the support is provided now to your wife. They look at the support that was provided by your father previously. So in terms of, so you're here in the United Kingdom, your wife, I take it, is in Pakistan at the moment.
Yeah.
So the problem is you're obviously within your father's household, but your wife wouldn't be living within your father's household because your wife is in Pakistan at the moment, and that's one of the requirements that would need to be satisfied under the extended family member route, where the person has to be either within your household, or secondly they need to be financially dependent on your father, but not just now. It would normally be before as well, before your father moved to the United Kingdom. I think it might be difficult to qualify under the extended family member route. I think, Brother Ali, your query is actually quite complicated because it deals with the impact that would have, that your dad's permanent residence application would have on the others. So it's not your normal European query. So what I would suggest is, if you leave your number with the control room, it's something that I would look at, and I will come back to you probably tomorrow if you leave your number with the control room. It is actually quite complicated, your query. Yeah.
No problem.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ali. Thank you very much for your call. It is actually quite complicated because the difficulty is that the father, who's a European national, qualifies for permanent residence probably at this stage, and the impact on the others, because they haven't completed 5 years in the United Kingdom, the impact on the son, the impact on any extended family member applications, I think is something that needs to be looked at more closely. So if you leave your number, Ali, inshallah, I will call you back tomorrow, and then we can have a more detailed discussion about that. Just going back to what we were discussing, we'd looked at the kind of documents that an applicant needs to get together in their home country when making a spouse application, such as the A1 life skills course which needs to be completed, the TB test that needs to be completed in the home country as well. Essentially, they're the two main documents. Now, I did say at the outset that there are certain differences for people applying from different countries. There are certain countries where there is no requirement to submit a TB test, and also there is no requirement to submit an English test. For example, if you have somebody with a US passport, then the US nationality means that they don't need to satisfy the English language requirement, because it's assumed that somebody who's born and brought up or a national of the United States would be able to speak English. So there are certain countries where there's no requirement to meet the English language test, and there are also certain countries where there's no requirement to meet the TB test. Again, if somebody actually resides, for example, in a European country or the US, etc., they may not be required to submit a TB test. Now, so one does need to bear in mind, in certain cases, there may not be a requirement to actually satisfy the English language and the TB test requirement at all. So they're the two main documents. Now, the other document that you need to bear in mind is that where the applicant has previously been married, then the applicant needs to obtain a divorce certificate, or if the previous partner has passed away, a proper death certificate. So you need to be careful about ensuring that you obtain those documents, and the documents which are being submitted are acceptable documents. So for example, if there's a legal marriage, there has to be a legal divorce in the home country as well. And there are very complicated rules about how the divorce has to be processed, etc. So you need to be careful about that. If there's an issue about a previous marriage, then you have to be careful about the documentary evidence which needs to be submitted to demonstrate that that relationship has ended, and the sort of formal documents that need to be submitted for that. So that's your English certificate, that's your TB certificate, and documents relating to the previous marriage. Then the final document that the applicant needs to get together is the actual marriage certificate, assuming that the marriage has taken place in the applicant's home country, which is in practice the case in 99% of applications, where the sponsor from the UK has gone abroad to India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, whichever country it is, they've got married there, and you need to ensure that you get a proper marriage certificate, which is in accordance with the rules of that country. So for example, let's take an example where somebody gets married under Islamic law in India, and they have a certificate from the mosque. That in itself would not be enough, because English law requires that Islamic marriage has to be registered in accordance with Indian law. So not only would you be submitting your Islamic certificate, more importantly, you need to submit the actual registration certificate, which confirms that the marriage has been registered in accordance with Indian law. So only then is the marriage considered to be a valid marriage under the law of that country. So similarly, every country has its own rules in relation to marriages. You need to be careful that it's not just the fact that you've married which is sufficient. You need to be careful, and you need to ensure that the correct document evidence in the marriage as required by the Home Office is actually submitted with the application. So as far as the applicant is concerned, normally you get asked the question, what does my husband or wife in their home country, what do they need to do? Well, as we've said, make sure you get the English certificate, the proper one. Make sure that there's a valid TB certificate. If there's been a previous marriage, has that been properly brought to an end? Have you got the correct documentation for that? And as far as this particular marriage is concerned, which is the basis of the application, have you got the correct documentation evidencing this marriage? So essentially, it's only those 4 documents that need to be submitted with a spouse application in the United Kingdom. There is an additional document which actually is not submitted in Sheffield when you make the spouse application, which is that the applicant in the home country, when the appointment is made with the visa centre, they will simply submit their valid passport. So if they don't have a valid passport, they need to make that valid passport. That's submitted with the visa centre in the home country, and it's submitted there because the visa sticker will ultimately be placed on that passport. But in terms of supporting documents, it's your English certificate, your TB certificate, previous marriage been brought to an end, evidence of that, and this particular marriage, which is the subject of the application, proper evidence in relation to that. So that's what the applicant needs to get ready in their home country. To some extent, the applicant has a much easier job than the sponsor, because in terms of documentation, only very, very limited documents need to be collated from one's home country. The vast majority of the documents actually need to be collated from here in the United Kingdom. And now what I want to do is now look at that in greater detail. Now, what is the key then documents or areas that one needs to look at within the United Kingdom? Now, if we just break it down into 3 particular areas that the Home Office will look at, and then we can go into that in greater detail. First of all, the Home Office will look at whether the financial requirement is met or not. Secondly, the Home Office will look at whether the requirement in relation to adequate accommodation being available for the applicant, whether that is met or not. And then thirdly, the Home Office will look at whether the evidence of the relationship subsisting is met or not. Essentially, that's the 3 areas that we need to focus on. And the evidence that the sponsor in the United Kingdom will be getting together will focus on those 3 areas: finances, accommodation, and the relationship. Because as far as the applicant is concerned, the applicant has dealt with the English requirement, the TB certificate requirement, the marriage being actually valid. That's been dealt with in terms of the documents, that the formal documents and certificates which will be submitted for that. Here within the UK, the 3 things that we'll be focusing on is finances, accommodation, and relationship. Now, all those matters are equally important, because if there's a problem with any one of those, potentially the application could be refused. In my experience, the key requirement that you look at before proceeding with submitting an application is to make sure that the evidence of the required evidence in relation to finances is available and can be submitted. So whatever the position, whether somebody is employed, self-employed in their own right, running a limited company, whatever the position, you have to make sure that the documents that are required in relation to each type of financial activity are available and are going to be available for submission to the Home Office. Now, in previous shows, we've looked at some very simple applications. Let me just run through the most simplest of applications, which is where somebody is employed. In the vast majority of cases where somebody is employed and they've been employed in the same job for at least 6 months, all you're required to submit is 6 months wage slips, 6 months bank statements, and an employment letter from the employer confirming the employment. There are other additional documents which need to be submitted, but they're not mandatory, such as contract of employment and a P60. They're not mandatory documents. The mandatory documents are your wage slips, your bank statements, and your employment letter. That's the most simplest of applications that you get. But you have to bear in mind, as I've just mentioned, that the financial requirement is and can be met in a number of different ways. So it could be that somebody is self-employed running their own business. It could be that somebody is self-employed running a limited company. It could be that they want to meet the financial requirement not by income, but they've got substantial savings, or they've got dividend income, or they've got income from rental properties, or they've got a pension. So there are a whole host of different ways in which the financial requirement can be met. And you also need to bear in mind that there are exemptions from the 18,600 financial requirement. So there are certain circumstances where somebody is in receipt of certain benefits when you don't need to be earning 18,600 per annum. You could be earning much less than that. It could be 120, 130 pounds a week, which comes up to something in the region of £5,000. You could be earning something in that region, and that would be sufficient. So as far as finances are concerned, there's a whole range of different ways in which the 18,600 requirement, which no doubt viewers have heard about, where the sponsor needs to be earning 18,600. How that requirement can be met, a whole host of ways that can be met, and there are also certain circumstances where there's actually no need to meet the 18,600 requirement. So what I would suggest is that where you're looking at making an application to sponsor your husband or wife from abroad, that you do look at how the financial requirement is going to be met in greater detail. We're going to take a short break. After we come back, we'll look at how the financial requirement can be met in greater detail.